Good evening. This is Bill Lacey, director of the Dole Institute. I want to invite you and welcome you, I should say, to our very first virtual program of the fall at the Dole Institute, our annual Journalism and Politics lecture. Tonight, our guest speakers are MJ Lee, who's a political correspondent with CNN, and former KU SAB member and KU graduate Francesca Chambers, who is the White House correspondent for McClatchy. Ladies, welcome to our program tonight.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Okay, let's start with a little bit of personal background and information. So MJ, I'll ask you to start this first, and then Francesca, I'll ask you to answer second. Tell us a little bit about your education and your upbringing.
Okay, well, first of all, Bill and everybody else there, thank you so much for having me and having me back. When I visited 4 years ago, I had such a great time and always hoped that I would be able to come back. So I'm thrilled to be back, though I wish that I were back on your campus instead of doing things this way. We can talk a lot about how much things have changed in the last 4 years. My background, I was born in Korea, grew up mostly in Hong Kong. I came to the US as a high school student and I went to Georgetown University in Washington, DC. And right out of college, I got a job at Politico, eventually became a full-time reporter. And then 5.5 years ago, almost 6 years ago now, we moved to New York so that I could start my job at CNN. And it's been a fun ride ever since.
Great. Francesca?
Well, Bill, as you know, I was born and raised in Kansas. And I went to the University of Kansas and was on the student advisory board. So you and I go way back. And I'd love to always embarrass you with this story, but I will do it again for a national audience, that Bill was my first major interview when I was a student journalist, when he was running Fred Thompson's presidential campaign. And Bill, if it taught me anything, though, you were maybe a little bit too easy to get a hold of. I have quite a hard time getting in touch with campaign managers these days for the presidential candidates, but it was a good experience back then, and I got the political journalism bug, and I've continued to work in political journalism. I'm currently the White House correspondent for McClatchy, as you noted. We have 30 papers across the United States, including the Kansas City Star and Wichita Eagle. So it's been a really pleasant opportunity for me to be able to write for a hometown audience as well as a national audience. I'm also on the board of the White House Correspondents Association. So that has been a real honor for me to also get to be a liaison between the White House and my peers.
Oh, that's fantastic. Francesca, let's start with you on this one. Tell us what a White House correspondent does. And then MJ, tell us what you do in your role as a political correspondent for CNN. So Francesca, start us off there, please.
Well, it also depends on where you work, Bill, in terms of what a White House correspondent does. When I was at my previous job at DailyMail.com, my job as a White House correspondent was primarily to do news of the day. If the president was tweeting breaking news, it was my job to hop to and get right on it, start writing a story. If the White House had an announcement, that was also my job. And of course, there are the fun parts, which are the daily press briefings and news conferences with the president. And if you're really lucky, then you get to travel on foreign trips with the president. You get to be on Air Force One. And I am so glad I got to do all of those things. At McClatchy, I'm more focused on big picture stories and reporting on the White House. Now, certainly when there's news of the day that pertains to one of our markets, that's something that I'll do, particularly if the president makes an announcement related to North Carolina or Florida and is taking a trip to some of those places. But my main role is to do the really 30,000 foot pieces that you don't always get a chance to do when you're dealing with breaking news and daily news, that looks into policies that the administration is pursuing, and big campaign pieces as we head towards the election, looking at different demographic groups and trends that I'm seeing in the election.
Okay, well, thanks, Francesca. MJ, speak to what you do as a political correspondent at CNN.
Well, my journey as a political correspondent at CNN has been pretty interesting. So when I first started at CNN, it was in 2015. And I am actually in New York City. The entire, I think, political unit at CNN is based in Washington, D.C. So I happen to be one of the rare political correspondents based in New York City. And in heading into the 2016 election season, this man named Donald Trump started making noise about running for president. And I think it kind of worked out for everyone to have me go cover his events. I was here anyway in New York City. And that just, snowballed into me covering his campaign full time for a little bit. And then closer to the general election, got moved over to covering Hillary Clinton's campaign. That's where Francesca and I spent a lot of time together on buses and airplanes. And then, when an election is over, I mean, this is an issue that you have to grapple with, I think, as a political reporter, no matter where you work. It's a bit of a different pace, right? You go from covering an election every single day, traveling a lot most of the time, to figuring out, so what is the big political story? And for me, heading into the 2020 season, I was covering sort of political scandals. I got put on the Me Too political beat for a while, so I was spending a lot of time back down in Washington, D.C. I was covering Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen. And then all of that led up to me covering Elizabeth Warren's campaign, starting on day one of her announcement. When that campaign ended, I got moved over to covering Joe Biden and his campaign, and now Kamala Harris as well. So I don't know, there's not really a typical day. I'm sure Francesca feels the same way. Some days start, with me waking up at 3 a.m. because I have, a 6 a.m. TV hit. Some days end with me going to bed very late because, our TV schedule is 24/7. Yeah, and it just, I think when you're in the election season and you're really covering a candidate, you kind of have a clear goal when you wake up every day of what you're supposed to be covering. And when you're not in an election year, that's a little bit less clear.
Mm-hmm. Both of you have been in journalism for a while now. I'm curious, just in the short period of time that both of you have been doing journalism professionally, how has it changed? What are some of the big changes that you've kind of followed over the last 10 years or so?
Well, I can go first. I think the massive change that I've seen between when I graduated and now, as everyone has talked about, is Twitter. That has been a big difference. When I was graduating, Twitter was something that was just coming out, and I had, as many had, no understanding of what kind of a role that was going to play in all of our lives, but particularly in our coverage of politics. I mentioned before that the president will just tweet policy announcements. He will also tweet that he's firing people. I recall that I was getting on a plane that was going to Asia for a vacation, and the president fired Rex Tillerson as I was stepping on the plane. And there's not much that you can do. I'm about to be without Wi-Fi for however many hours it was, about 12 hours, I believe. And I was on vacation, and you have to just step away from that story sometimes and let other people cover it and say, okay, there will be plenty of other and additional opportunities like this. But that was especially really hard the first year of the Trump administration, the first 2 years of the Trump administration particularly. It felt like every time that I decided to step away or take a break or even just put my phone down for like 5 minutes, something would happen that was breaking news. And that is something that you get more used to the pace, is what I've learned in a presidency, of knowing how that person and how their staff interact. But then, of course, COVID-19 came along, and it completely shook everything up all over again. Like MJ said, I was someone who in the 2016 cycle was a campaign embed. That essentially means that I was on the plane full time with Hillary Clinton's campaign, with a few exceptions. And when you are there, you have unlimited access, for the most part, to the senior staff who are also traveling, and you can talk to them, you can ask them questions. You get to spend a lot of time with the candidate. Often they come back and they talk off the record to you. You get to know them a little bit. And one thing in this election that has been very different as a result of the lack of travel is not having that same in-person access, but that access whatsoever to people, and having to find new ways of making those connections and getting my information.
And I think you know, this is certainly related to what you were just saying about Twitter. You know, the news is so incredibly online now. I have been in journalism for 10 plus years now. I graduated in 2009, and I never had the experience of being a reporter who wrote for the evening deadline, where, you know, the model is that you work for a paper and you file a story and you better meet your evening deadline, and you know, expect that readers are going to open up the paper and they are informed by, and they get a sense of what stories are most important and driving the day by seeing what stories are on the front page, right? I just think that concept has been so incredibly diminished because the news is so online and it just never stops. And it is constantly being updated. There isn't just one version of a story per day. It is multiple stories, multiple blog posts, long stories, short stories. And I think the Twitter culture that Francesca was just talking about, that certainly feeds this sense that the news just doesn't sleep, right? I mean, whether it is cable news that is 24/7, whether it is, you know, you even write for a traditionally print outlet like the Washington Post or something like that, the New York Times, doesn't mean that your day ends just because the paper deadline is over. You also have the website, which is, you know, just as important or considered just as important as the physical paper now, right? I just don't think that is how journalism and news was perceived even, you know, 10, 15 years ago. And I think I just made it under the wire where I really did not have that experience of feeling like, you know, the news happens for a set number of hours a day. And when you go to sleep, the news also goes to sleep.
Okay. One of the things that truly astounded me, and I've been around, as you guys know, a fairly long time in politics, so I'm not astounded very often, but in February, right before the South Carolina primary, Vice President Biden was being written off by all the pundits. And I would sit and I would watch Fox for a while and go to MSNBC and go to your network, MJ. And lots of the pundits were saying, you know, Biden, there's no way for him to come back. He can't get back. I'm curious what the two of you think about what happened in the reporting, and especially the punditry, more than anything else, where so many got that wrong.
Well, look, I do think that there was obviously a huge shift in the race, South Carolina onwards. And I don't think you're wrong to say that a lot of pundits and, you know, analysts who were analyzing this race were ultimately wrong. I don't think they were wrong necessarily in the moment. In the moment, Joe Biden was having a really bad race. He was not doing well. And, you know, I think the way that this was analyzed at the time was, boy, it's going to take something really big for him to be able to revive his campaign. And something really big did happen, right? It was unexpected. I think a lot of people were surprised, a lot of reporters included. But what South Carolina was able to hand him was this sense that finally he was seen by people as a winner, somebody who could win. And I think that ended up making all the difference. And also just keep in mind, you know, that was at a moment in the race too, when a lot of people were fearful about Bernie Sanders being able to pull this one off this time around, right? And I think the fear of somebody who is, you know, a lot more to the left, like a Bernie Sanders, being able to pull this off, that really ended up pulling people together. And in the end, ultimately, it was Joe Biden who was the last one standing. And Joe Biden was the candidate that these people who didn't want to, you know, accept somebody like Bernie Sanders, you know, they all decided, well, he's the guy that's winning now, so we all better get behind him.
There were also two other things that happened, although that was, I think, a very good summary of what happened for Joe Biden. I would just tack on to that and say you had the beginning of the pandemic bill. That's another really big thing that happened, that you had states that started either to delay their primaries, or as people dropped out and consolidated against Joe Biden, the pandemic and the inability to campaign and hold in-person rallies was certainly a factor. But you also had this throwback to old school politics where Jim Clyburn of South Carolina endorsed Joe Biden. And it really did give him the heft in that state that he needed to be able to pull him across the finish line and set up for what is now the general election scenario and situation, Bill. And I do think that that's not to be discounted. I also wanted to go back to something that MJ said about the traditional print deadline, because I feel like I've done this in reverse. I'd worked for a long time for an online only outlet, and now I'm working for traditional print deadlines again, which are very, very real. In my head, you absolutely have to meet them. But don't underestimate how much the front page papers still mean to presidential campaigns and candidates, and including the White House. I mean, I'm still also very giddy every time that I have a front page story on the Kansas City Star, the Miami Herald, or the Charlotte Observer. But especially in those swing states, the front pages still do drive a lot of the news of the day. And the candidates I found in my experience this election cycle and campaigns are very, very aware of that.
Yeah, both of you make very good points. Francesca, you really kind of set up my next question for me, which is, let's go back to right before South Carolina. Let's look at the president's situation. He had a fantastic economy. We had yet to really know what coronavirus was going to do and how serious it was going to be. And he was looking at a real possibility of having Senator Sanders as his fall opponent. Is that a classic case of how fast things change, guys, in politics?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's very sort of jarring almost to imagine the scenario where Joe Biden didn't have the huge win in South Carolina and didn't, go on to have the streak of wins that ultimately led to him being the Democratic nominee. I mean, even just thinking about the kind of coverage that we might be doing if Bernie Sanders were the Democratic nominee, and how potentially different that might be, and what a different, challenger he would be to Donald Trump compared to somebody like Joe Biden. Yeah, politics and elections can change in an instant, and it can change what feels like just overnight, right? And that's exactly what happened in the 2020 race.
So I had actually covered Bernie Sanders, by the way, in 2016 before I covered Hillary Clinton, and I was covering Bernie Sanders at the beginning of this race, much like MJ. I changed jobs in between actually, and so I go from covering Democrats to covering Trump's reelection, so I spent a lot of time covering Bernie Sanders at that point, and I was not surprised by how well that he was doing in the election, Bill. He had experience having done it before. He had amassed a fundraising operation, a large number of supporters. He was driving a message that against Donald Trump, and particularly with the blue collar voters in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, which are states that Sanders had done really well in 2016, those foreshadowed Hillary Clinton's loss in those states. And so just carrying that across to the 2020 election, he did seem like someone who really could have been the nominee had it not been for a series of events that I would say included the pandemic, but also that real fear that MJ talked about of other Democratic presidential candidates banding together and saying absolutely not and getting behind Joe Biden.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'd like both of you to speak to what it's like covering your beats in a pandemic versus how it would have been, let's say, a year ago. How have things changed?
So I can go first on this one. The biggest thing that has changed, in addition to what I had said before, is again, not having access to a lot of the people that you would normally have face-to-face access with. So even from the White House, many people might not realize this, it's not a situation where you can work from there all day, every day right now because of social distancing. And so we're in rotations, many of us, and we only get to be there certain days. So you really have to make your time when you're there count. But at the same time, you had to get really good at what I call phone game, which was not something that I had been particularly great at prior to a couple years ago, because when you have all these face-to-face interactions, I'm also someone who has been prided myself as a reporter on really being able to sweet talk myself through any situation. If I can just get in front of people, like I can get the information, I just know it. And when they're in a situation where they don't have to answer your phone calls, heck, you might not even have their phone number. They can hang up really at any time if they want to, honestly. That creates a completely and totally different dynamic that I have had to work around as a reporter. Another thing related to that is needing to ask the questions far in front of your deadline, because when you can just walk into the White House press office or see people on a campaign plane, you can toss a question to them, file your story. When you have to plan around the idea that they might not see your call, that information for hours, maybe a whole entire day, you can't afford to be doing things last minute. So it requires you to be a lot more organized than you had to be before.
I guess I would say, and this sounds so obvious, but the biggest difference for me pre-pandemic and during mid-pandemic is that the election, the 2020 election, is not necessarily the number one story, and it hasn't been for a while. You know, the last time that I was out on the road, before things got really serious and, you know, cities and states started locking down, was Elizabeth Warren dropping out on March 5th. She dropped out. I found out that I was being moved over to Joe Biden's campaign right away. And I thought, okay, so I need to get sourced up really quickly and I'll start traveling with him. Just had this image of sort of the busy time I would have on the campaign trail now covering this new candidate. And my last flight that I was on March 5th, the day that she dropped out. I took a shuttle home from Boston to New York City, and I've not been on a plane since. And, you know, the months of March, April, May, I would say even going into June, it was as though, at least for CNN and what you're seeing on air, and I'm not, you know, I don't want to, you know, undersell the great work that we all do on CNN.com. You know, that's not a website that ever sleeps, and the political coverage there doesn't ever go away. But just purely in terms of what you were seeing when you turned on CNN was always coronavirus, right? That was the biggest story. That was the national crisis. And it remains to this day a huge story. I think it's only probably in the last month or so, particularly heading into the conventions, that the election started being a bigger part of our coverage that we really wanted to cover every day. So the biggest sort of difference for me, I think, has been actually a lot of sort of lifestyle, personal things. You know, you sign up to cover a campaign and you have this expectation. Like I remember very well what it felt like in 2016 to not be sleeping, to be constantly on the road, eating terribly on the road, not remembering where you are when you wake up in a different hotel room, you know, every single night. And I signed up to do 2020 fully expecting that I would have another experience like that. And I did a little bit last year when I was covering Elizabeth Warren. But once the pandemic really was front and center, I think that experience of the full frenzy of covering a campaign, being a full-time campaign correspondent, that just kind of went away. And I think now that the campaign coverage is, you know, a little bit more front and center than a couple of months ago, yeah, covering Joe Biden, the candidate, as a reporter for CNN is really strange and really different, right? A lot of his events are pooled, which, you know, means that not every reporter can actually go into the event. It means that reporters are basically, different outlets are sharing resources. So fewer number of reporters are going into the event. This is all as a part of the COVID precautions that the campaign is taking. And it has also meant, just as Francesca was talking about, just less access to the candidate. You know, you can't casually catch Joe Biden working a rope line and stick a recorder in his face and get a question in. You simply can't do that because that kind of access just doesn't exist. Everything is so tightly controlled. And so unless you are in the event on the rare occasions where he is having a press conference and you are one of the reporters called on, just having that kind of sort of casual interaction and the opportunity to question your candidate, that has been very difficult to come by.
And Bill, if I could actually jump in, I think the other thing about covering an incumbent president is that I would have already had that kind of restricted access this time. I wouldn't have had the unfettered access like we did if Hillary Clinton wanted to come back on the plane and talk to us like we did in 2016, because with a president, Secret Services around, the only people who fly with the president of the United States are people who are in the pool. She mentioned a pool, and there's a White House pool as well. And so even at the events, it's not as if the president is walking over and talking to reporters. So even if you're just covering the events, you would just be going to the rallies. You wouldn't have the same kind of access that I think that we did with both candidates in 2016 when neither of them were incumbents. And they would come, at least Donald Trump would come through the spin room at debates, and he would take questions down a rope line with reporters. And certainly now he still speaks frequently to reporters in the Oval Office or has Labor Day news conferences, but those are a lot more, as she just noted, tightly controlled events versus the kind of free-flowing events that we saw back in 2016. So maybe the coronavirus wouldn't have changed in that way that much more for me, but I have noticed the same change that you're tracking, MJ, in the television coverage. I remember that early on in the election, and also in 2016, I was on TV frequently talking about my work and about the election. And then with coronavirus, it just stopped. It completely just stopped. And it picked up again, I would say about a month ago. It was really the start of the conventions that the national attention started turning more towards politics. And of course, while we all miss talking about politics all the time, I have to say it was actually pretty nice over the summer when I didn't have to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning all the time to do television hits or staying up really late. I was remembered during the conventions when I had to do a 1 a.m. hit on MSNBC with Ari Melber to talk about the convention for the West Coast. I was more tired than I remembered being when we used to do this.
Yeah, Francesca, I don't feel like I see like dark circles under your eyes right now or anything like that.
It's the lighting. It's just the lighting in my living room, which is another thing. We're doing television from home. We're doing events like these from home. We've all had to invest in these home setups. My husband is my production assistant, and he always has to set everything up for me. And that's been a complete and total change about this. But in some ways, I then also think that's been a change for the better. Instead of at times having to spend 2 hours running back and forth between a studio, you can turn on the lights and start doing an event like this, and it takes almost no time at all.
Yeah, this is definitely my TV studio right here. This is where I did TV for a good number of months. Now I'm just starting to go back into the office in a very limited way. If I have, a couple of hits coming up, then I would go in, but not stay the entire day. Or we have a camera that is set up outside of Hudson Yards so that you don't even have to go into the building. And there are a lot of restrictions. But yeah, this is a corner of my dining room in our New York City apartment. So this is where the magic happens.
Yeah, those are some great examples, guys. I very much appreciate that. Talk a little bit about how both of you keep your personal opinion out of your reporting.
I get asked this question a lot, and I feel like I always give an answer that's so obvious sounding, but I think it's by sticking to describing what has happened, quoting candidates, based on what they have said, and just being straight about in your, if you're writing something or you are standing in front of a camera to talk about whatever it is you're covering that day, just being very straight about, describing that something has happened or someone has said something, or this is a dynamic that we are seeing in the race. And I don't know, I guess I just haven't actually had too much trouble. I can't think of big instances where I felt like, okay, I am so rearing to, share my opinion right now and go off in this direction because I personally actually feel this way about a certain issue. Maybe that just comes with, practice and as you get a little older and you mature as a reporter. But I just think when you, make sure you are sticking to really just describing the events that are unfolding in front of you and making sure that there's always, context, right? So if X candidate had said something that is, patently not true, just making sure that you're pointing that out, but not as, that doesn't have to come in the form of an opinion. You can easily do that just by saying, here's a quick fact check, right?
That is exactly right. There are other people who will criticize politicians of both parties. And I think it's our job to just present the facts as they are. Here's what candidate X said. Here's what candidate Y said in response. If candidate X has said something that there is information that's publicly available to dispute the accuracy of that, then it's simple enough to just say candidate X said Y, but here is what the data says. Things like that, and there's never really a reason to put my personal opinion in it whatsoever. And I just do not feel, as a straight news journalist, in any case, that is what readers and what television viewers are seeking from me.
Mm-hmm. Guys, most of the average of the national polls is showing the vice president with roughly a 7-8 point lead. Some of the polls in battleground states are tightening, some of them aren't. Would both of you take a few minutes to give me your assessment of the race as it currently exists?
We've been talking about this a lot the last couple of weeks, particularly since the conclusion of the Republican National Convention, where we saw that the president and the folks around him, his allies, his supporters, wanted to paint a picture of a country that wasn't actually really grappling with this global pandemic. Depending on who you were listening to, you might have almost thought that this pandemic was behind us. We literally heard past tense being used with some people in describing the coronavirus. Clearly, there was an attempt there, and this was very thematic, an attempt to sort of turn the conversation to something else, and that was the issue of law and order, describing, what the country would look like under Joe Biden. This is going to be a dangerous time if you elect Joe Biden for president. There's going to be lawlessness and really just this picture of chaos. And I think what we have seen since then, and public polling has shown this, is that people ultimately care the most right now about the economy and how the pandemic is being handled. And, despite the president obviously working very hard to try to say that the economy is roaring back, I think the reality for a lot of people is that just isn't what they are seeing in their own lives, right? Whether it's because they've lost their jobs or their business has closed, or they, have family members or friends who are going through economic hardships. And this is not going to be a light that gets, switched on and off. It is not going to get better overnight. And I think what we are going to learn in November is whether there is enough of a sense in the country that, yes, the pandemic will definitely still be around. I think that is, we can state that confidently right now. And the economy is going to be in bad shape, but do enough people feel like, the President Trump can right the ship at some point, even if it's not something he can do right away. And I think that is going to be the thing that determines more than anything else whether Joe Biden gets elected or whether Donald Trump ends up getting another 4 years.
And Bill, I've often been focused on more of the granular details, like the state polls. And if you do look at the must-win states, or a combination of states that the president would need to put together, there are really only a certain number of pathways to victory to him. This is not an opportunity, I think, as his campaign originally thought, where they were going to be able to expand the map and add all kinds of different states. If anything, if they add any states, those would be states that they would absolutely positively need to put him over the top after he lost potentially states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. But even by the Trump campaign's own assessment, because they put a strategy session on for reporters virtually this week, there are very few pathways to victory for him that do not include Florida or do not include North Carolina. And they have already insisted that even if he won those states plus Arizona, that he would need to pick up Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, or Michigan. And that is assuming he wins every state that he won in 2016 again. And so as you've seen their strategy, he spent a lot of time in Pennsylvania. He recently went to Wisconsin. He's going tomorrow to Michigan as well, because their assessment has been that they have to pick up at least one of those states. Whether they can do that or not remains an open question, in that will all of the states in the so-called blue wall that had been the blue wall vote together? Can he just pick off just one of those states? Could he pick up Minnesota, where he was really close last time, and lose all three of those and it's fine anyway? Certainly they're looking at all of those scenarios, but that is the situation that they are facing right now, is rather than a blowout victory, is how do they get to 270?
I also think it's important to keep in mind too that yes, we have this countdown to election day. We're all counting the days, and obviously November 3rd is going to be incredibly important, but there are going to be people now, increasingly so as we get closer and closer, who vote well before November 3rd because they are mailing in their ballots. And so what this means is that this is not going to be a decision that is simply made on November 3rd by people, walking into their polling places. We are going to have people making up their minds the choice between Joe Biden or Donald Trump in the coming weeks. And I just don't believe that people vote based on how they think things will be for the country come November 3rd. I think a lot of people are going to be voting with their gut, and their gut is going to be about whether they feel good about the state of the country right now. And that could be, in the middle of October when they decide to drop their mail-in into their mailbox.
And that also plays into the current strategy. The president has been spending a lot of time recently in North Carolina. For folks maybe in Kansas who don't know this, North Carolina starts to send out its absentee by mail ballots earlier than any other state. They started sending them out last Friday. So before there's even the first presidential debate, some people in those states like North Carolina, will already be getting their ballots. They will already be voting. And so Donald Trump's campaign has decided that to put a lot more time and resources and effort into that state early on. At the same time, that also is an opportunity cost. When they are putting him there so often, and also in Pennsylvania, that means he isn't traveling to some of these other battleground states that are going to be critical in this election. And of course, there's coronavirus, which limits travel at a time when he might have otherwise been doing multiple rallies a day, as he was in 2016. And so they're having to be pickier and choosier. And there is a real question, to your point, MJ, about how that strategy of the focusing heavily on the mail-in ballots and voting will play out for them come election time. Will they be the ones in the situation where maybe they should have traveled or campaigned somewhere else more frequently?
It came out today that Bob Woodward's new book, he interviewed the president, and the president admitted quite early, I believe, that he knew how serious coronavirus it was, and it was more deadly than flu. How do you guys think that this new piece of information that we're picking up will affect the election?
It's hard at this point, Bill, for an assessment of any one piece of information. We talked about the 24-hour news cycle and what's coming out. Just before this, it was the Atlantic article and the reporting that the president had disparaged veterans on multiple different occasions. And I mean, that was everything. That was every question. That was all of the national reporting for a couple of days. And now it's the Woodward book. So certainly the White House has been pummeled with book after book recently, and then the Atlantic article too, and having to spend a lot of time on the defense pushing back against this reporting, which is certainly not where they want to be as they're heading into an election. Certainly any campaign wants to be on the offense, talking about what they would do in a second term agenda. And we have not heard the type of policy speeches from President Trump about those sorts of things that one would expect. Part of that is because of coronavirus. Part of that is because of the reporting. Part of that is, of course, because when the president again gets up at a Labor Day news conference, he can set that agenda, and that's not specifically what he is laying out either.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, you take a look at, even just like the span of the last week, and you look at what President Trump has had to do and what White House officials have had to do and senior campaign aides have had to engage in, they're basically on defense, right? This is how many days, consecutive days in a row, that the president and his team have not been in control of whatever they want their campaign message to be, because they have had to respond to these damning the reporting, the quotes from the president himself that are in this book, right? Any amount of time that the president is spending responding to this kind of reporting is time that he can't spend driving home his own message. And I think that certainly isn't helpful. I also think that Francesca was talking about how this has been sort of one thing after another. There was the Atlantic story, and now this week there's the Woodward book, and who knows what is coming, in the coming weeks. You can imagine that there are some voters out there who, and I think anecdotally, we have talked to plenty of voters who say this about the president and their, decision to support him in 2016. You hear somebody say something to the effect of, look, I know the president is not perfect. I don't think he is always the most, tasteful in the way that he speaks publicly, or boy, I sure hope that he would lay off Twitter. I certainly don't like that. But at the end of the day, I do think that he will be better than whoever it is he's running for. Or at the end of the day, I think he has this one redeeming quality that I think is very important. I think one risk that he certainly runs right now is that if you have a collection of stories and books that are coming out, reporting that's coming out, things that he has said himself, that starts to sort of come together as this bigger composite that paints a bigger picture of a candidate that more and more voters find not acceptable, that's more and more voters who are going to be less inclined to vote for him, even though maybe 4 years ago they were inclined to excuse certain parts of his behavior or conduct or things that he has said in the past.
MJ,
go ahead.
I just find that to be one of the most interesting narratives or outcomes that we'll see in this election is, do voters take that information and say, 4 years ago, I excused these things, but I just can't do it this time? Or do they say, I really do think that his policies would be better, and the last 4 years, they were okay. COVID wasn't his fault, and they come out and vote for him again. I do think that is an overarching question in this election that really gets beyond some of these individual stories in the day-to-day news.
And he's not running against Hillary Clinton this time, right? A candidate who was flawed and was disliked by a lot of people. I think that's like a very simple thing that I actually think gets missed a lot when we look back on 2016. I think it's important to do the state-by-state analysis and how closely Donald Trump managed to win in some of these states. But at the end of the day, one of the best things that he had going for him was that Hillary Clinton was not liked and was not popular, and a lot of people just ended up not heading out to the polls because they weren't enthusiastic about her. And he's not running against Hillary Clinton this time, it's Joe Biden.
One of the things that research has consistently shown is that women candidates are getting a double standard in media coverage. I'm curious if you guys think that has improved over the years, and if you think Senator Harris will get less of a double standard than, say, Secretary Clinton got 4 years ago.
Well, there are also two really different women and different candidates. Certainly Hillary Clinton had a long history in politics. There was a lot of time to build up the impressions of her that people built up. As she was running for president, her husband had already served in the White House for 8 years. There was just a lot more that was known about her versus Kamala Harris, who certainly is already a senator, but has been in the public spotlight for a lot less time. She has a much more of an opportunity to define herself as a candidate and as a person that Hillary Clinton didn't really have heading into that election. And certainly there was also, I hate to bring it up, but it was a big topic at the time. The email scandal just overshadowed that entire election and really followed Hillary Clinton, and she had a difficulty getting out from under it. And Kamala Harris doesn't have that same sort of baggage to deal with in this election.
And I, I had the interesting experience of, covering Elizabeth Warren full time before moving on to cover Joe Biden. And so this pertains, more specifically to the experience of covering her. But I think by a lot of people's standards, she ran an excellent campaign. She had a clear message, and even rival campaigns would tell you that, and would tell you this throughout the primary, that she was running an impressive campaign. And at the end of the day, there were some, Democratic strategists, people who work in politics, who sort of looked back and said, it doesn't necessarily seem like, if you were purely grading this on the person who ran the most competent campaign, there might be a case to make that somebody like Elizabeth Warren would have been that person, but obviously she is not the one who ended up winning the nomination. I had really interesting conversations with voters, and this is something, a kind of question that I always made sure that I asked, because I was genuinely curious, compared to 2016, whether voters would feel differently about this idea of nominating a female candidate. And, you would ask people, do you think the country is ready for this? Do you think the country is ready to elect a woman for president, a female nominee, and then eventually elect them for president? And a lot of people would say, look, I think I'm ready. I am certainly, ready to do this and don't have a problem with the idea of a female president, but I don't think the rest of the country is ready. I have friends who are afraid about what would happen to a female candidate. I have family members who might not be ready to take the plunge. And often that kind of sentiment actually came from fellow women. I think there was a real fear, especially after 2016, that women don't get a fair shake, particularly women in politics. And I think a lot of voters were driven by the concern that, and especially, Democrats who are so driven by the desire to get Donald Trump out of the White House, that the best chance that they had to get him out of the White House was, in the end, ultimately to elect a man and not a woman.
Okay, this summer, obviously, our country is really focused a lot more on inequality and equalities. So I have a question to ask both of you. I'm curious if either of you have ever been subjected to gender or racial discrimination in your jobs, in your professions.
This summer, Bill, I think was really eye-opening for many people, and myself included. Growing up in Kansas, I felt like I had a really great experience growing up where I didn't feel like that was ever an issue for me. And when I, this summer, especially when we started covering the racial justice movement and all this came to the national forefront, it really awakened me to the responsibility and role that I feel that I have as someone who is in the national spotlight, as someone who is in the White House press briefing room, to start drawing more attention to some of these issues that so often get overlooked. This summer, we also had coronavirus, and the fact that it disproportionately impacted communities of color. And that is such an important issue and such an important topic. And so that is something else I started picking up and covering aggressively as well. And I think that we just all have a responsibility as journalists and as people to make sure that with these issues that are, again, really important, that we are shining a light on those particular things. And that's something that I really learned throughout the summer.
And I guess I would say, when I started covering the 2016 campaign and really started traveling the country to cover Donald Trump, I had this very interesting experience of almost seeing the country for the first time. I was not well traveled across the country. I had spent most of my time, studying in Washington, D.C., and obviously I eventually moved to New York. But Washington, D.C., New York City, they're not like the rest of the country. And I think I probably underestimated that. And once I started to travel to the middle of the country where Donald Trump was spending time, I think I became very aware of, what the experience is like to walk into a gymnasium full of people and you are very keenly aware that you are the only person who is not white. You are the only person of color probably in the entire gymnasium. So you become sort of more sort of conscious of the fact that there are places in the country that look like that. And you start thinking about, well, so what do these people want and what are they driven by, right? And probably the conversation with a voter from 2016 at a Trump event that I remember the most clearly is, Donald Trump was saying all these things about immigration and people coming into the country and using, colorful language, sometimes offensive language. And I was interviewing voters about that. And there was a man who said he was a Trump supporter. And he said to me, I'm so sick and tired of these people from Asia coming into the country and having kids, and they get all this stuff for free. And I'm tired of it. Like, the people who are originally from America, we're not getting anything. And all these new people from, other countries are coming in and getting access to all these things. And I'm so tired of it, all these new Americans. And he looked at me and said, but I don't mean any offense to you. And it was very clear in that moment. And I don't know whether he meant offense. He said he didn't mean offense, so I'm going to take him at his word that he truly did not mean to offend me. But it was very clear that message and what he said was directed at me because he saw me as one of those people that he had just been describing. And I think just that experience and conversations like that really made me want to better understand some of the grievances and the frustrations and the concerns that people have across the country that I just think that I didn't necessarily, think about enough or didn't, understand clearly before I went out on the road in 2016 and met these voters and talked to them.
Okay, thank you both for those responses. I have one final question, and then we're going to open it up to audience questions and answers. But both of you guys are fabulous role models for young people because here you are about 10 years after school and you already have big, important journalism jobs. Speak to the advice that you would share with young people, women and men who are currently studying journalism and are hoping to have a long career in journalism. What advice would you give them on important steps for them to take?
Oh, I love this one. Okay. So number one, it's okay to be persistent. It is absolutely okay to be persistent. Don't feel bad. And I especially mean this for women because I have a problem with this. Don't feel bad asking for what you want. Don't feel bad reaching out to sources and pestering them. Sometimes it's on the weekend, sometimes it's the morning. Okay, that is what the people who are the government officials, they signed up for this job. Guess what? All your competitors are probably texting them and bothering them too, asking them that. And if you're not also doing that, you're just gonna get scooped. That is something that I really had to learn. And so that's number one. Two, I mentioned organization earlier. You should absolutely be keeping track of the contact information for just about anybody who you think could be a source or could be useful to you at some point in the future, because I cannot tell you how many times when you change jobs or you just don't save somebody's number or keep track of something. Right now, even people who you're interning with, they might seem like, someone who you sat next to at lunch. And one day, some of those people, and always the people who you least expected probably, by the way, are going to be chiefs of staff on Capitol Hill. They're going to be working in the White House. Heck, they might even be getting a job over at CNN, have the ability to hire you. And it is so important to keep in contact with those people. But I also believe it's always good, if you can, to leave as good of an impression on people as you can. I try to be a nice person as often as I can for that reason as well. I think it's a good thing to do anyway, but you just never know one day when somebody can come back into your life. That being said, you should definitely hold their feet to the fire, and it's just too bad if they don't like it.
I think I would echo the persistence part of what you just said, Francesca. I think when you are young and you're still in college or you haven't had journalism experience yet, it's really daunting to feel like you could, ever possibly become a full-time reporter. At least that's how, it felt to me. And I think asking for help is okay. And I will tell you, 9 out of 10 journalists, because we have also all been through this experience of not knowing how to get started, or not knowing enough people, or not knowing, whether we're going to make it in journalism, we are going to be eager to help. So whether it is reaching out to people through school, or alums that are now journalists now, or family friends that you have, you will not be judged for being aggressive in your outreach. And I just want to emphasize that I think, most of the journalists that I know, they are more than eager to help. They're eager to, get on the phone with you, help you look at your resume, help you talk through, what are ways for you to apply for certain jobs or different steps that you can take. So yeah, that's the one point that I would really emphasize.
Very good advice from both of you. Thank you very much. If you're watching on YouTube and you have a question, submit your question. I've got the first one. And MJ, you already referenced this anecdotally, but I'm still going to ask his question. Mark Johnson asked, have either of you experienced hostile audience reaction to your presence at a campaign event? I guess, MJ, you weren't saying you weren't sure that was hostile, but have either of you felt like you were in a hostile situation at an event before?
Yes, at Donald Trump rallies, especially when he started directly referencing the media and pointing at TV cameras and saying, you never cover me, you never show our crowd sizes. There was a moment in the campaign where I think our network and our bosses realized that this was very serious and not worth taking the risk. So we started traveling with security folks. So yeah, there has definitely been hostility that I have confronted in past campaign events.
Francesca?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. I would agree with you, MJ, in terms of the moment of hostility that you can feel if people are pointing at you and booing at you particularly. But at the same time, frequently in 2016, I was covering a different campaign. And so it's a little bit harder for me to speak to the same experience that you had, given that, again, in 2020, we're not as out at those rallies as frequently. But certainly in 2018, when I had the occasion to go to the same sorts of rallies that you're describing, I had similar experiences. But
I should also quickly note, I think the hostility that you get from people now too, a lot of it comes through social media. So just training myself to not get too involved in reading all of the tweets that are coming my way from unverified accounts, especially if I've had a story that I know has gotten a lot of airtime and, one candidate's, supporters is not going to be happy with it, then it can potentially be a bad day. It's just like a rabbit hole that you don't want to go down. But yeah, Twitter is not a happy place. I think that's an understatement.
It's so hard too. It's so hard because I want to be responsive to readers, right, when they're asking legitimate questions. So I like to read through them. But then, of course, there's always people, like you said, who are going to be disappointed and unhappy too. And you have to not let them get in your head, because you can lose an entire day like just thinking about those comments, which is certainly not productive for anybody. But Bill, when I was thinking before, what I was going to say is that in those experiences, I also had occasion to get to talk to various people in the crowd, like MJ was describing before. And I would say that almost all of my experiences talking to people in crowds have been really positive. I found that when I've been able to get out there and ask them questions, then they often ask me a few things about me, my reporting, about the journalism, about the White House. We end up having really great conversations that go beyond just the questions that I'm asking. And almost every single time, people walk away and are like, wow, thank you so much for spending that time to talk to me. I really feel like I have a better understanding of what you do and what covering the White House is like. And I just think that has been a really important and productive experience, because if people are basing their opinion on what they believe the journalists are doing and how we're covering the White House versus having actually met somebody and had a conversation with them, those are two really different things.
Okay. Our next question is from Mr. David Ranney, and it's about a specific episode, and I'm not familiar with it, so I don't know if either of you are either, but he says, what did you take away from Rachel Maddow's interview with Michael Cohen?
I didn't watch it. I'll just be honest.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to watch it either, and which is also unusual because I feel like, again, early on in the pandemic, I would watch everything, just everything, every interview that anybody did, no matter how long they were. But as we get closer to the election, you really have to pick and choose your spots a little bit more, because especially covering the Trump administration in the White House, they're out on television multiple times a day, different officials. Then afterwards, they do what's known as a gaggle with reporters, where they talk for 10 to 15 minutes, sometimes on the driveway too. So then I have to watch videos of that. You have the president holding different events all day. Sometimes Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are out there too. And so when you combine all those events, it can be hard to watch every single thing. So my first priority every day is I make sure that I watch every single thing that the president does. If I cannot catch it that day, I go back and watch it over the weekend. It helps me to understand what he's saying that's new. And that helps me obviously to do my job and report on the news, but also catch those kind of trends. So I'm less concerned about people who are not currently White House officials or a candidate. Okay.
Here's a really tough, but a very good question from Braden. And I hope, Braden, I got your last name right here, Bangalin. He asks, according to a Gallup poll in April 2020, America's trust in news sources has continually decreased and hit its lowest point ever in 2020. What's fueling the distrust, and what are the solutions?
I think some of the solutions, though, are what I just talked about, Bill, is making sure that when we are out at those sorts of events and we have opportunities to talk to voters, is engaging in those conversations. I do find that every time I have one of those conversations with someone, they come away with a much better understanding of the media and what we do and how we do it. And of course, their views, their political views as well. And so I think that just as an individual journalist, that's something that we can be doing to help bring back up the trust in media.
I also just think, there's such a fog machine right now because of the amount of information that is available to people, especially online. And, people have a hard time sorting through what are the news articles that are worth my time? What are the news articles that are well reported out and fairly reported and that I should take seriously versus, something that doesn't quite meet all the journalistic standards that a story should meet. And I also think, I have to say, I don't think it helps. You were asking what fuels this. It certainly doesn't help that we have a president of the United States who, has the megaphone that he has, who is constantly accusing the media of, being out to get him and being dishonest and spewing lies. At some point, I think that message does get through to people. So I can't imagine that is not a big factor in why people might trust the media less than they might have at a different time in our country.
But it wasn't just Donald Trump, MJ Lee. That was the one thing I was going to add to that, is that covering Bernie Sanders, he frequently would also launch broadsides at what he called the corporate media. He would do whole fundraising campaigns attacking media. He at almost every single rally that he had would attack and launch broadsides at the media as well. And so it's not just limited to one side or the other. You saw this coming from both ends of the political spectrum, and that, I believe, has had a massive effect on a large amount of voters.
This is a question that I didn't get to, guys, in my interview, but I've got a little bit of extra time here, so I wanted to ask the two of you your thoughts on this. I think one of Vice President Biden's big challenges in the campaign, and if he's elected, one of his big challenges as president is going to be balancing his views represented by Slot and others Democratic. How do you guys think he'll go about that?
Hey, Bill, your feed froze a little bit just as you were asking the question. Do you mind asking it again? I did not catch that.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries.
MJ. I said one of the challenges that Vice President Biden faces in the campaign and will face if he's elected president is squaring his more centrist tendencies with the more leftist tendencies shown by Senator Sanders, the Squad, and many progressives within the Democratic Party. How do you guys think he will go about managing that tension?
I mean, I think Joe Biden obviously knows how Washington works, and his background is that he was a senator for many, many years. And so much of what he is able to do in his first few years in office is going to depend on the makeup of the Senate. I think that if Democrats take the Senate next year, then we are talking about a completely different ball game, right? He's going to head into his first year with the power to potentially get legislation through the House and the Senate, and take really bold actions in a way that he obviously would not be able to if Republicans maintain control of the Senate. So I think that's probably the biggest factor in terms of just purely what kind of legislative victories could he have, and sort of how much he could strive for, because you're right. I do think there's obviously a tension between the Joe Biden, the candidate, and the person, who ran in the primary, sort of reassuring people, there are all these progressives that are, to the left of me, and trust me, I'm not like that. And that is not the sort of, pragmatic campaign that I'm running. But now I do think that there is a lot of pressure, I should say, for him from the progressive wing of the party to make sure that his ideas are, reflecting of and taking into account the real progressive energy that is out there. I mean, you mentioned some of the, folks on Capitol Hill who really embody that for a lot of people across the country.
And there's always that pressure, Bill, in the first 2 years, as MJ was referring to. With Barack Obama, you had healthcare. With Donald Trump, it was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. You had, both times when you're in that very short window of not just the first 100 days, but extend beyond that before the first election after someone's been elected. There's always that pressure when you control both chambers to get things done. I think that with Joe Biden, the only thing that we can really look at besides his long Senate career is the Democratic Convention, and the fact that people like AOC were not given large speaking roles, and the fact that while Bernie Sanders did speak, there weren't some of the other progressive voices that you would have expected, particularly the younger up and coming progressives who were given large speaking roles. And he was at least attempting to signal to people who might be concerned about that, given that that is a big issue that Donald Trump has campaigned on. He has said that if Joe Biden was elected, a big thing that voters should worry about would be the number of progressives that he surrounds him with. Joe Biden really seemed to be trying to convey to voters at that convention, you know me, you know who I am, you've known me for many years, you don't need to be worried about that. Look, see, they didn't even have speaking slots, so you don't need to worry that much about that.
Okay, I've got time for two more questions, and I have two from our audience. George Burdick says, you've talked about how the pandemic has made reporting harder, but are there any techniques you've learned from grappling with a pandemic that you think will help your future reporting?
Okay, go ahead.
I just think in general, we are being a lot more flexible and thinking out of the box. The idea that I have done interviews over Zoom from this corner of my apartment, when typically that interview would have to be done in person or in a studio. I think in a lot of ways, I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think that means that reporting in some ways has become more accessible. There isn't as much that goes into making that kind of reporting happen. And I think especially with TV, it's very time consuming what goes into, the beginning of when you have to get ready to do a TV hit, getting to the place, getting ready, getting to the place, getting in front of the camera. And I don't know, I just feel like we're a little bit quicker on our feet now because it is possible to make perfectly fine TV in this setting as opposed to going into the studio. And I do think in the big picture, we are all going to come out of this more agile and thinking about the way we do our jobs very differently. And I don't think that's a bad thing at all.
I also think, and this has been something that society has realized just as a whole, not just us reporters, that it's really drawn more attention to just taking care of yourself and not running yourself ragged. That the idea that when you are getting a full night's rest, as we mentioned earlier, that you can make better decisions and be a better reporter. And I have seen my own reporting improve as a result of getting that kind of rest. And I think that's really important. As far as the nuts and bolts of reporting, it's taken us back to the basics in certain ways, whereas I could just rely on some of those face-to-face interactions before. I've really had to dig deep and start figuring out, okay, who are the people who are in these communities, who are living there, who are talking to voters that we can interview, like county party chairs, and other people in other community leaders, and relying on them and having to build up stories around those people, which are always good people to talk to anyway, because they're not just a singular voter or 5 singular voters that I spoke to at a rally. They're people who were talking to lots of different people. And that's something that they've really helped me to foster and develop while working at McClatchy too. And so I think that's something that after this election, I'll carry with me. And it was a really good lesson to learn.
Okay, this is our final question for tonight, and it's a very good one from actually our student advisory board coordinator, Mandy Snodgrass, who asked, how do you find the balance between being known as firm, strong, and confident women in your profession while still being approachable and building friendly relationships?
I mean, I get approached by people, whether it's voters or just people who are out on the street, I think especially when they see that there's a camera or they see a CNN flag on the mic. And I don't know, I never mind that. I think that people being curious about your job, particularly when they realize that you're a reporter, is a great thing. So I don't know that I've necessarily struggled with the whole am I approachable or not thing. At least that's what I like to think.
I think the only time though, MJ, it can be difficult is that we do want to be approachable, you do want to be friendly, you do want to set good relationships with the people that you're covering your sources. This is a long game for those of us who want to be in this business for a long time, not a short game. But at the same time, you have to, like I said before, we were talking about this earlier, you do have to be firm. You do have to set boundaries. These are, this is our job, and it is our job to get information from people. And you certainly also don't want them to think that you're a pushover either. And so I think that's maybe different with sources than it is with people that you meet on the street who absolutely happy to talk to. Thanks so much for coming up and saying that you're reading our work and watching it. Really appreciate it. Actually, when people do that, because we talked about Twitter and sometimes the negative comments. And so it's really nice actually when someone wants to come up and say something nice to you about your reporting. So anybody wants to come do that, I think we both welcome that.
Yeah, and I'm sorry if I misunderstood the question. I thought that it was mostly about people you meet and encounter when you're out on the road doing reporting. I just don't mind that at all. I totally agree with you in terms of setting boundaries when you're dealing with sources and making sure that, yeah, you're not a pushover. And there are certain rules that they have to abide by in the same way that journalists do too, right? When they're trying to be a source, they have to abide by the rules that you set with them before having a conversation. I think that's really important.
Well, MJ, you guys have been fabulous guests. We really appreciate your time, taking the time to join us and come back virtually to the Dole Institute. Hopefully next time it'll be in person, but thank you both very much.
Thank you so much for having us. This was great. We really enjoyed it. Thanks, Bill.
Bill, I've been just such a fan of these since I was a student. So it's really, really an honor to take part in this with you tonight. Thank you so much.
Yes, well, it's great to host both of you. And I want to tell our audience, thank them for joining us tonight, and tell you that next Tuesday night at 7 p.m. will be our annual Constitution Day program. And we hope you can join us for that program. So thank you all very much. Thanks for joining us.